Welcome to Real Rover. I'm your roving host, John Craig. Real Rover へようこそ、クレイグ・ジョンでございます。Introducing you to people you would never have heard of if it wasn't for Real Rover. Here we go. Our guest today on Real Rover is Paul Bridger. Now, Paul has been in my life since back in 1999, I believe. And I have been following his path since then. I've been following his activities, his studies, his incredible way of lending support to people and to communities. He's a great example of a healer and an educator. So let's meet Paul. We are beginning our talk, and so I'm very privileged to be sharing time with Paul Bridger today, who is in Calgary, I believe. I'm in North Saanich on Vancouver Island. I've known Paul for many years, but we haven't been in contact for many years. It was only recently that we reconnected, and I understood what it was you were doing, Paul, if I may just bring this up, which is you're responsible for intentional directions, subtitled Awaken Significance Within. And it's very clearly written here what you are most involved in, which is helping seekers make meaning of extraordinary experiences with the sacred, which is something that right now I believe that we need to be considering with a lot more seriousness. But right off the bat, experiences with the sacred can mean a plethora of things. What does it mean to you?
Thanks, Ehan. For me, the sacred could mean different things for different people. But mostly what I'm referring to is when people have what is often called in the literature over the past 100 years or so, a mystical experience, where there's an encounter with life, often an embodied encounter, though sometimes it happens only in their consciousness and it's not something they're physically seeing or perceiving. Some of these things might include a near-death experience. It might include birth. It might include an illness, right? It might include, and this is where my work tends to focus, it might include participation in a plant medicine ceremony. And in that way of using the plant medicines to alter our consciousness so that we might perceive the sacredness of life more clearly. So then the role I'm offering into the community is to support people before and after those kinds of experiences.
Understood. There's a great deal of chatter on the internet about what people think are sacred experiences, which in many cases can simply be, for them, brought up in a modern technological, economic, political milieu, which does not accept, understand, and certainly doesn't condone people having experiences of the sacred. And plant medicines are very often reduced to a quick means to a quick end, which is some kind of sacred experience, one would hope. But your emphasis seems to be, since you are multifaceted, and the word coach doesn't really come close to what you're doing. Your name suggests it, bridger. You literally are bridging the modern Western political economic model that you were born into in Canada with the indigenous traditions that you've been so enmeshed with for so long. So let's just go there. How did this connection with an entirely different stream of consciousness, which is the indigenous worldview, how did that happen to you and when?
I love it. By accident, I would say. Or maybe by design. I grew up in the suburbs of Vancouver, a small community called Surrey in British Columbia, Canada. And like you say, I grew up in that Western kind of dominant mindset, right? I grew up in privilege. I grew up in a middle-class family. You know, I never wanted for anything. I always had food and shelter and went to school and learned things and was just humming along in the system. You know, the matrix was working. And then in 1998, when I was just 26 years old, I had a diagnosis of a kidney disease that is a genetic disease traveling in my family. My father had the same disease. It seems maybe his mother did as well. And that diagnosis prompted me to seek alternative methods of healing, because I knew, watching my father grapple with this illness, it's called polycystic kidney disease. I knew, watching him, that there's no cure. The only treatment is dialysis and transplant. And so I knew that was all the West had to offer me, allopathic medicine had to offer me. And so even at that young age, I said, I need to find something else. There must be something else, right? I wasn't really raised in a religious belief system, but I had this faith within me that there must be another way, another option. And I had already kind of gravitated more towards natural healing, in the sense of I was all about exercise and good diet and vitamins and minerals and, you know, like stay healthy sort of idea, right? Stay healthy naturally. So shortly thereafter, I was invited to my first sweat lodge, which was a very confusing experience for me. It was unlike anything I'd ever felt or seen or heard before. But it opened something in me. And then within the year, so this would have been 1999, I heard rumor in the community I was living in Nelson, BC, that a man was there traveling with medicine from South America. And that caught my attention. I can't really explain why, but it caught my attention to be, maybe that would help. And so in meeting with him and beginning that first experience with the Piroa tradition of using yopo and the medicines that go with it, something began to take a hold of me. And it was a growing awareness that there were other knowledge systems in the world, right? It wasn't, at that point, it was specific to southern Venezuela and the Piroa, but that I became aware that there were other knowledge systems in the world that had not been extinguished by colonization. And so that realization and that openness turned my attention toward, well, where do I live? Whose territory do I live in? What practices and ceremonies are still alive here? And so in my turning my attention toward that began a path of exploration and meeting and encountering so many generous elders and teachers who, although I come dressed as a descendant of Europeans, perhaps an embodiment, as a male cisgendered person, perhaps even an embodiment of the oppressor. And so many people, time after time, would open their hearts to me, open their fireplace to me, show me things, tell me things, listen to me, and how confused I was coming from my upbringing and culture about healing and how do I do this and how do I help myself, but also how does that help my children? How do I help my community? So that's really how it began.
Surrey brings an image of very pampered lifestyle, typical liberal Canadian background. You can get anything you want. You can be anybody you want to be. That's kind of magnified in the succeeding decades into let's just call it, for lack of a better word, a totally me culture, which is based on a paradigm that you just described, which will diagnose you as having such and such a disease that there isn't really a way to help. But there is, and you found that doorway out of necessity. You found that doorway, and you began a relationship, let's say, first of all, with a plant coming from an entirely different worldview. You began a relationship with a plant. Now, saying something like that, I began a relationship with a plant, right? Mm-hmm. Well, back then I started a relationship with a plant. Mm-hmm. But we really need to communicate here what that actually involves. Mm-hmm. What is a relationship with a plant, and how did that begin to work in your system? Mm-hmm. Where did that take you? So let's just talk for a minute about your knowledge of that particular plant that came along as the first part of this bridge, which you called yopo. What's the correct term for it in that tradition?
Yeah, in their own language, they would say yopo or yohua, and the Latin name given for at least the seed, one of the ingredients in this medicine, is Anadenanthera peregrina. So it's a tree, but I'll back up just a little bit and say that it's the medicine practice from the Piroa. They use a suite of plants, so it's not a single plant. They use a suite of plants, much like in other traditions. A brew, often known as ayahuasca, is a combination of plants that are cooked together into a beverage or a tea. The way the Piroa use their medicine, they're still combining plants to prepare their medicine. And some of the same plants that are used in ayahuasca, some of those same plants are used in this ceremony as well. And one of which is the seed of the Anadenanthera peregrina. And, chemists look at it like the power that's in that plant is the NN-DMT and the 5-MeO-DMT, that both are present in that plant. So that's a very powerful visionary chemical, right? That's within these plants. But it's just one part of what's in there, right? It's just one part of it.
And how do you take this? How do you take the plant, Paul?
So the way the Piroa use these plants is first there's tobacco present. So they use they usually roll it into a kind of cigar, and they refer to it as hate. And so they roll this tobacco like that, and that's used, and the smoke is used to kind of create that environment around for this work to happen. And then after the hate, they'll use what they call tuipai. And this is something I can send you written down so you can help with the translation. So in their language, they call it tuipai, also known as Banisteriopsis caapi or ayahuasca, or it goes by many names depending on the tradition, right? And that they harvest the root bark, and then they chew that directly. They just eat the bark straight.
Mm.
And then after that's given some time, usually 20 to 30 minutes, to begin to take effect mostly over the digestive system. It turns off a kind of the monoamine oxidase inhibition in our guts, right? It turns that off so that whatever medicine's coming in next has full access across the blood-brain barrier. Then the next medicine that they provide is that mixture of plants that have been ground together in a mortar and pestle and made into a paste that then is cooked by the fire. So that paste it's a raw paste and made into a patty and then cooked by the fire. Then that patty could be broken into small pieces, and those pieces could be ground into a very fine powder and then inhaled. So the powder is inhaled directly up into the nasal cavity. Yeah, so that's how the combination of those plants is administered.
You experienced this presumably after your first experience in Canada. I believe you went to visit these people and to hold ceremony with them. Is that correct?
I have, yeah. I visited a couple of times. I went back to the community to learn.
And is that community presently active with its ceremonial work, its healing work? How much recognition does it have in the community now, which is, of course, a different paradigm? It must be. Everywhere in South America has been colonized. So how are they surviving? How are they doing?
I appreciate you asking that question, because my own experience in visiting teachers like that has really deepened my own awareness of my privilege to be born and raised in this part of the world and to be able to access these kinds of ceremonies and knowledge. Because my teachers, it's a struggle there, to be honest. The way colonization plays out in Canada over these past few hundred years is quite different than how it's played out in Venezuela. I mean, even days ago, I heard about a young Piaroa leader, someone who's defending their territory, right, who was assassinated, right? And that's just that political activism of like, this is our ancestral territory. You can't just come in and take whatever you want and log it, right? And so leaders like that are persecuted in that area. And then my teachers, the first teachers I worked with there, they have crossed over now, right? They died. The last one died. Bolivar died in six, almost 7 years ago now. And at that time, when I was visiting with him there, it was very clear that they struggle to continue that practice, mostly because of colonial imposition, in particular from a group called the New Tribes Missions. And so there's this ongoing, even in today's age, this ongoing persecution of people who practice their ancestral medicine and healing as though it is some kind of devilry, right? That it's somehow connected with Satanism. And so for practitioners to be able to continue their work right? The way their families have always taken care of their own health, the health of their children, the health of their territory, the health of the animals and plants within their territory, which is what they live from, that is threatened.
It's totally global.
Mhm.
Every indigenous culture, it seems to be going through the same challenges. And it seems to me, I know that Canada is often lauded as a country which has done a lot to admit the mistakes, let's say, of colonization. Even in my area here in North Saanich, the local mountain, which is called originally Mount Newton, has now been returned to its original Aboriginal name, which unfortunately I can't pronounce. A local park too. These are like band-aid things I'm looking at here. All right, we recognize that it's actually you people's land, but then when it comes to having a traditional ceremony that goes back millennia, you can't do it. It's illegal. These substances are illegal. This doesn't meet the requirements of modern psychoanalytical methodology. It's outdated. There isn't enough scientific evidence, etc., etc. Now, I know that you studied anthropology. Was part of your desire to go into anthropology to further bridge that massive chasm that I've just described?
I wasn't thinking about it like that at the time. The reason I found my way into anthropology and eventually specialized in medical anthropology was because I was already working with the medicines and working with these teachers who traveled and shared these medicines with me. I entered into indigenous territories where I just happened to be the white fly on the wall, right? who was witnessing elders and leaders and medicine people from different cultures, some from what's now called Canada, some from what's now called Venezuela, meeting and sharing songs and knowledge and medicine with one another. And I just happened to just be along for the ride in a way, right? But it showed me something old. It showed me these ancient patterns of indigenous collaboration and solidarity, in how these knowledge systems have always persisted regardless of these 500 some odd years of at least European colonization in this part of the world. So somehow catching a glimpse of that led me to be like, well, so now I'm a white person witnessing something I think is really important to be happening in the world. So now what's my role? Am I just the chauffeur? Am I just the philanthropist, the funder that helps make these connections happen? Right? Is that all my role is? So what I did is I began to turn my attention towards psychology. I was like, well, I know it has something to do with healing. It has something to do with healing our minds and how we perceive and understand things. So I began that way. And after 2 years of studying psychology and kind of everything, I loved the developmental psychology. I loved a lot of that work. But then we started getting into abnormal psychology. And everything started turning towards the DSM, the Diagnostic Statistics Manual, right? And I started to just be perplexed of like, really? We're working backwards from what medications do things to people, and now didn't make sense to me. So I began to explore, well, what is this field of anthropology? People who for 100 years, the initial anthropologists, of course, weren't trained in anthropology. They were trained in other things, biology and other kinds of studies, who went and spent time among peoples in other parts of the world, right? Other cultures than their own, right? So that fascinated me more. I was like, this notion of cultures meeting one another, that's what gripped me. And I was like, so how do I become a useful instrument for that to continue? Right? And so that has continued to lead me into, here I live in what's called Calgary now, but among the Blackfoot, they call Mohkinsists. It's the elbow, it's the meeting of two rivers here. And that falls in Treaty 7. And this is Blackfoot Confederacy territory. Right? There are numerous nations who, before treaty was even signed, created this place for themselves. The Tsuut'ina, the Stoney Nakoda. There's 3 different Blackfoot groups. They all speak different dialects of the same language. So in living in this territory, it became very clear, well, that's who I need to connect with. That's just part of the work. So as I study anthropology, I learn about cultural methods of healing, how it is in different parts of the world, whether that's Polynesia or South America or India or wherever anthropology is teaching us about. I'm living it on the ground by finding my way into the local community to offer help, like literally show up and offer to chop wood and carry water, right? The ancient way of being helpful.
However, the fact that you chose anthropology, I think, was significant because to be an effective bridger, you have to have weight in both traditions. You have to have the respect that you have obviously gained by chopping wood and carrying water, by helping, by entering their world and showing that you're not only interested, you're willing, you're ready. And in this culture here, having conversations like this and doing what you have been doing as a coach, which is not really a very good term for what you do, I agree, but you've got 2 traditions here that you are very familiar with. And I'm imagining that you want to have more of an impact as a bridge. And right off the top of your head, what kind of impact? And given the remainder of your life, we're talking about your vision now. What could you hope to achieve given the depths that colonization has gone to eradicate these very, very many different cultures? What would you assume you could do?
So I see myself at a confluence of traditions. I don't know if it's at a confluence of traditions or as a confluence of traditions. I'm informed by many and by many experiences with people who speak very different languages from one another and have very different worldviews and ways of being, It wouldn't be fair of me to paint all my teachers with 1 or 2 brushes, right? Each is coming from such a unique tradition, which is beautiful. And I feel so grateful to coming from where I've come from where my family's come from, to have encountered that and to be welcomed, to be made to feel like I belong there as a helper. So my vision that's been developing over the years is about creating more opportunities for those traditional indigenous knowledge keepers or elders or healers or however we see them to come together, there's so many different ways that can happen, but it just feels like it's inherent in my name, and I can do that in a lot of different areas of my life. But this idea of bridging, and for me, it's about bridging culture, and I may be a beneficiary of that for sure, right? And I'm so grateful for what I learn along the way. But what's most important for me is that these leaders, these healers, leaders from their communities have these opportunities to come together in physical space, in ceremony, on the land, to listen to one another, right? To share their concerns about what's happening in their family and in their communities, how each government is dealing with their people, right? The way that oppression is continuing, so that there can be solidarity continuing to be generated. How they share their knowledge, their songs, their dances, their medicines with one another. That's the big vision I have in my own life, is to consciously play a part of that unfolding more.
Well, that's very clear. You're aware of the immense difficulties of such an undertaking. Immense difficulties. But if you're going to exert yourself using your capability as a bridger, then that would be the natural direction of your efforts, to do the very best you can to bring. And that's an important point you brought up. This is not one or two traditions. These are hundreds. And around the world, we're talking about many thousands of different cultures with different languages and different practices. However, they all share, it seems to me, from my limited understanding, it seems to me that they all share the idea of medicine. Every single one of them has a concept of medicine that is entirely different from what the word means to us now in English. So could you share what you understand now as medicine?
That idea of medicine has changed for me over the years, because as a youngster, of course, my parents giving me antibiotics was probably, and other kind of home remedies, little remedies around the house. That was probably my first experience with the idea of medicine. Here, take the medicine, it's bitter. Even to Mary Poppins, right? Take a little sugar to medicine go down, right? This whole notion that came from my upbringing, right? This medicine doesn't taste good, but it'll help you. You'll feel better, right? And so I was brought up that way, and always related medicine to the healthcare system, which in Canada is a free system, right? You're signed up and you're a member of it, and you receive it, right? You go to the hospital and you don't get a bill, right? You have to pay for medications, right? And so for me, it was like that until my late teens, early 20s, when that's probably the beginning of me becoming aware of herbal medicine, right? That one might take herbs or decoctions of plants rather than a pharmaceutical. And for whatever reason, however I was wired, that appealed to me more as a youngster. I was in my teens and early 20s. It was like, no, that's more, that aligns with who I am more. It's a plant, it comes from the earth. I will prefer natural, right? And so early after that diagnosis, that's one of the things I began to explore, even before finding my way into that sweat lodge, was Ayurvedic medicine, Chinese medicine, Western herbalism, where I started to understand plants as medicine. Once I began to use those sacred plants from South America, right, the ones that alter our consciousness, I began to understand medicine differently, right? Because I started to see, oh, well, there's drinking coffee, which is a plant, and it has this kind of effect on me. I get very excited and talkative. Or there's drinking chamomile tea, which is a mild sedative and helps me relax. I started to understand plants that way.
Mm.
But now that I started to experience these plants that alter my consciousness, my understanding of medicine changed. It was something more than just physiological, which I think is what my early understanding was. Is like, you take that and physiologically your symptoms will go away and you'll feel better. What started to happen with these other plants, and then happened as I moved into other kinds of indigenous ceremonies that don't use those strong plants, was an awareness of consciousness itself and prayer as medicine. So that really changed for me. And then by participating in ceremonies like the sweat lodge and like sun dancing, I began to recognize how consciousness and prayer could be embodied, in that we could perform prayer. We could perform that degree of conscious expansion with our bodies. We can do it in a sweat lodge. We can do it sun dancing. There's so many ways. Those are just two examples. So the notion of what is medicine changed yet again. And now I might summarize, I wasn't expecting this question, but I might summarize it with, our way of life is our medicine.
I'm glad I asked the question.
Yeah.
Because it's fundamental to indigenous healing systems, knowledge, wisdom around the world, that there is some kind of medicine that doesn't necessarily involve plants, because there are parts of the world where shamanic ceremony, for example, is carried out through drumming or dancing, and like you say, with a sweat lodge or vision quests.
Yeah, in this territory, it would be common, like the most common access, I'd say, would be fasting.
Be fasting.
Just go without food and water, and you will experience medicine.
You will definitely experience medicine. I know, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
This is an important distinction you made as your understanding of medicine expanded to include prayer, to include way of life.
Mm-hmm.
It's important now because, of course, we're in the age of capitalizing on indigenous healing in a big way. Some can be summarized as ayahuasca tourism. So the idea is you can relocate your body to a different physical location in Costa Rica or Peru or wherever, and there will be a shaman there, and it's okay, he's going to be fine, right? And you're going to drink this, and you've read all the spirit molecule stuff already, and you know about how DMT affects consciousness. So you're ready and primed to go in there and get your experience, and then you're going to lift off and come back with your experience, and suddenly you're going to be a more sacred person. This is a classical example of what's happened around the planet with all indigenous wisdom, all of it. There's a capitalization on it. And I can give you a simple example. I worked with Humbats Mens in the Yucatan, who was a traditional solar priest, one whose medicine was connecting to the sun and praying to the sun. and the so-called Mayan calendar came along later, much publicized by a very artistic, knowledgeable, and high level of communicative power individual by the name of Jose Arguelles. And Jose Arguelles, Dr. Jose Arguelles, had a phenomenal impact on the world through the idea of a new calendar that was based on the Mayan system. Now, they were not in agreement, these two individuals, even though the elder from the Yucatan had been the tutor to the younger white man, who later became world famous because he was a white man. Simply because of that, because of his privileged connections, education, and everything else. And the humble Humbat's Mens was, in a sense, reduced to a tourist guide, taking people around, showing them a different understanding of this calendrical system, which did connect to medicine, to way of life, and all the rest of it. So what I'm getting to here is that you've made the important point that it's the prayer of the community, the entire operation of the community, which happens to be using a plant, that is actually very instrumental in any resulting change of consciousness. It's all together as one. And this is why there are now all kinds of problems appearing with ayahuasca tourism. Young women getting raped by horny shamans, right? For example, case after case is coming to light now, taking advantage of these women's vulnerability, for example. More and more common. People not being able to reintegrate this experience of the so-called sacred that they had for 3 days before they came back on the plane. It's a huge problem, which is part of, I feel, which is part of the work of bridging, is to share with people it's not just the chemical action, it's not just the plant, it's a lot more than that. Now, how have you addressed that in your own work, Paul? You're obviously aware of it. How have you addressed this huge dichotomy?
Could I just ask you to, there's lots for me to speak there about, how have I addressed what exactly?
How have you addressed the perception of healing plants that doesn't include the culture, the ceremony, the wisdom tradition, but tends to focus on its chemical ability, its neurochemical ability to affect consciousness? So you don't really need a shaman, you don't really need the traditions, because it's all about brain chemistry, right? So how do you address that when you have people who are willing and open and able and really want to get a sacred experience, but they want to encapsulate it in 3 or 4 days, which is ayahuasca tourism, right? There's another huge bridge that we have to deal with. Is there any advice you can give them?
I appreciate you bringing this up, because I have to constantly regulate that awareness in myself. And one of the ways I do that is remaining connected to these lineages I find myself at the confluence of, in the sense of, how would my elders respond to my behavior, right? The kind of built-in accountability that as human beings we used to always have in the village setting, right? If we misbehaved, we would have been corrected quickly, right? No, not like that, like this, right? And so I don't live in the same place as a lot of my teachers, though many live here, not all, right? So I can't be corrected all the time. So I have to learn how to self-correct as I go. I'm going to make a lot of mistakes as I do that, I'm sure. Do I hope that people will respectfully approach me and teach me and correct me? Yes. Am I prepared for other forms of correction? Call it persecution or trolling or whatever people want to call it. Yes. right? It's a big community we live in now. To me, it seems that this issue really comes down to, I could summarize it with just two words: relationship and reciprocity. So, and this comes back to one of the questions you asked earlier, right? How do you get into a relationship with a plant? What does that even mean? What does it mean to be in relationship with something that's not human, right? Not even animal, right? It's not like even that closely related to us, you know? What does that mean to become or to deepen into relationship with the water source in the area that you live in? What's that relationship, right? Who knows where the water that comes out of their tap comes from, right? So these are relationships that I think we're always responsible for becoming aware of and then tending or taking care of. So one of those, when elders trust you enough to teach you something or to share medicine with you, you have a responsibility to that relationship, right? And of course, culturally, we come from different backgrounds, and we might think of respect differently. Maybe, that's a possibility I'll put out there. But it seems to me that we're able to learn about respectful conduct interculturally, right? As we learn to work with people who don't speak the same language as us, don't eat the same food as us, don't think the same way about life as us. There's still a way to create reciprocal relationship with people. And by reciprocity, I don't mean you just paid for your retreat, and so you've paid for it, so we're good. Not like that, but more like how I've seen exemplified or demonstrated by my teachers, which is that they take responsibility for caring for their teachers and their teachers' families for multiple generations to come. So it's not just a buy and sell sort of arrangement. It's more of a how do I ensure that my teacher's grandchildren will be taken care of? That's a different way of approaching these things, right? Even the example of like, I need to make sure that I learn this song correctly or properly or the best way possible. Because if my teacher's grandchild returns to me some years later and says, "You spent time with my grandma. What was that song she sang? I don't remember it. My parents don't remember it." That's my responsibility, right? So it's the same way with a song like that as it would be with any kind of knowledge that traditional knowledge keepers share with us. It's a responsibility. Could we go out and abuse that and make a ton of money and become millionaires and whatever? I haven't seen a lot of examples of that. I've certainly seen people mess it up. Possibly people could do that. I see there's a different way. And I'm so glad that I've had the mentorship to show me something else, so that whenever I get to impart what was told to me, right, what I was taught, I can do so with a, would you like to support our teachers' families, right? How do I do this work to help both myself, my family, my clients, their families, and our teachers' families and lineages benefit from everything we're doing? How do I do that? That to me is a different kind of awareness or consciousness. And I think that kind of reciprocity, that kind of relationship focus would change the conversation. I also think part of my responsibility is to protect my elders and teachers. And so sometimes the way I protect them is not really telling people where they are or how to get to them, right? But rather waiting, because we show ourselves quickly to one another, right? If we're willing to notice, if we're willing to see, people show who they are. So the slower I make a process for people, right? It's like I end up acting like a bit of a gatekeeper, right? It's like I'll offer the teachings my elders have given me, and those are enough for people to change their lives. They don't need to get to the elder right away. It's my job to protect that elder from clowns coming in who might want to abuse them, right? Now, over the years, I can see people who have a good heart and are genuine and want to really contribute to this vision of my teachers' families surviving. That's how I look at it. It's my job, having been taught, to learn how to ensure their survival into the future.
Got that. Very clear. Very important point you made, Paul, because wasn't that always the way it was here on Earth through all of our evolution, minus the last few hundred years, when we suddenly got different ideas, for better or worse, in our heads about reality and the sacrifice that had to be made at the time was that the old ways had to be steamrolled into oblivion, basically, whether consciously or unconsciously, it's not important. It happened. Wade Davis, in conversation, referred to this process as ethnocide, the absolute murder and wiping out of indigenous knowledge, not just people and histories, but knowledge, which, when you consider it seriously, as any thinking individual should, it is a massive scar on our history. It's a huge gaping wound, and who knows how that came about. It's a great mystery, but it did. And the result is, to get back to it, tourism, which will give you the hit. You won't have any responsibility to the community or what happens to them. You can forget about them next week. You've had your sacred experience, which you can talk about in bars for the next 12 years. And everybody goes, wow, where did you go? What was the shaman's name? I want to go too. None of it entailing any responsibility whatsoever. So you've mentioned something very important. It's not just your lifeline that's going to continue, hopefully, through your own friends and associates and children and family, that they have a relationship with a still existing community of people who understand the meaning of medicine. So now you're actively involved in what? Tell us what you're doing now as part of this process that we've explained, hopefully, to viewers.
Just before I go there, Ehan, I just want, what was coming up for me as you summarized that was how these last few hundred years, maybe longer, the culture I come from, right, which is mostly Western European, have become distracted by competition and greed. And that's what wipes out, like Wade's talking about ethnocide. That's what feels threatened by difference. So that's what stuck out for me at first there. This somehow we've been distracted or misled by competition and greed. It's about me. Our society has become very individualistic. So even as people pursue these experiences, this medicine, and it takes them into these faraway places, or even the shaman visits their house, or however that is, right? It's still easy to get distracted by that. you know. So what I'm up to right now is some months into beginning my own private practice as an integration coach. That's how I refer to myself. I agree, coaching is a strange way to call it, but it works for now. And an integration coach, meaning that I offer community integration circles. One is in person at a fire. That's once a month. That's tonight. And then one happens online. And so people can get a hold of me through the website easily to be able to participate in those integration circles.
Oh,
And an integration circle to me is a place where we gather to listen to one another for what's really going on in our lives. Maybe that's an integration from a plant medicine experience. Maybe it's an integration from a loved one who's just died. Maybe that's an integration from waking from one of those dreams that just feels super significant to us. Maybe it was a car accident and we just about died there. We left for a bit and then they revived us. Or I don't know what it is for people, but I'm creating a safe yet courageous space for people to be able to express themselves about what it is they're going through in their life, right? And I hold it in a kind of a circle format. So that means everyone's going to be able to speak. Everyone's going to be able to listen. Often there's songs involved. I love to sing when I've got people gathered. So I do those kinds of things by donation in the community. And then I also work with people one-on-one. And that's if someone feels like they just want more concentrated time. I want time with someone who has some experience with integrating their own spiritual plant medicine experiences, ceremonial experiences, whatever it is, and who can listen to me well enough that they might reflect back to me what I'm saying, but also have the kind of courage to be able to ask me questions that help me really get to the meat of what I'm trying to understand in my life. So I do both of those things. There's a community work, a community level, and then there's also an individual level.
Understood. I think that we've covered some good initial ground today, but it's certainly not the end. You've already inspired me to take part in at least the online circle, because that's obviously very important, as is the actual circle around a real fire. I would like to consider this an opening.
Great.
Further discussion, because it's obviously important right now. It's obviously important. If I could paraphrase it, the entire world is going to hell in a basket.
It certainly appears that way.
It would seem to be the case.
Right.
And we have now, touching on anthropology, we've now got evidence from a cave in Israel of very advanced tool working techniques, especially a whole variety of blades have been found to cut things of different thicknesses for different reasons by individuals who they still can't say were Homo sapiens, but they certainly weren't Homo erectus, and they probably weren't Neanderthals. But they lived in a cave and they had very high capability of making tools. And it seems that they were having experiences of medicine even then, 400,000 years ago, which has doubled the age of Homo sapiens overnight. So we're talking about a very, very long story. It seems to have in the very last segment of it, gone completely and utterly out of its mind. That's how I would paraphrase modern Western technological society based on greed and competition, as you correctly pointed out. I don't think any intelligent person can argue with that. It's greed and competition, right? This is what you get after 100 years of greed and competition. Hello, right? Sick people with very little spiritual awareness, no real medicine in their lives, hanging desperately, psychologically and spiritually, at the end of a rope over the edge of a cliff. That's where we are. And so people like yourself have an incredibly, from my point of view, an incredibly important function. And I salute you and I celebrate you. And I look forward to the next discussion, which will be when we're ready for it.
I look forward to it. Yeah, if anything, I may be that person reaching down over the cliff and offering a hand.
I think you are.
Yeah. I really appreciate you taking the time out to invite me to this conversation, Ehan. Thank you so much.
Just the beginning.
Just the
End
beginning.
broadcast, and we'll see you again, sir. Thank you.